This is the story of Marcus Hale and his wife Sophie Hale. They had built something real together, not perfect, but real in the way that only years of ordinary mornings and shared silences can make a thing real. The trouble with real things, though, is that they can erode so gradually you don't notice the damage until you're already standing in the rubble. Marcus was a man who believed in certainty, in the solidity of what he could see and touch and account for. And Sophie had always moved through the world with a kind of quiet purposefulness that he had once found grounding and had lately begun to find opaque. What this story is really about is not betrayal in the way people usually mean it. It is about the particular loneliness of two people who love each other and cannot, for reasons of pride and fear and an almost willful emotional blindness, simply say so. It is about what happens when protection starts to look, from the outside, exactly like abandonment. The kitchen smelled like coffee and dish soap, which was the smell of every weekday morning in the Hale household. And Marcus stood at the counter reading something on his phone with the particular stillness of a man who is not actually reading anything. Sophie moved around him with the practiced ease of long cohabitation, opening the refrigerator, closing it, finding the travel mug she needed on the second shelf of the cabinet above the kettle where it had lived for 3 years. And there was something almost choreographed about the whole scene, something so smoothly functional that it had stopped requiring either of them to pay attention to it. "There's yogurt," Sophie said, not looking up from the counter where she was pouring coffee. "I'm not hungry. You said that yesterday." "And I wasn't hungry yesterday either." She glanced at him then, briefly, the way you glance at something you're not sure has changed. Marcus was 41 years old and still had the kind of face that looked better with some tiredness in it, stronger around the jaw, more settled. But lately the tiredness had gone past the point of becoming him and had begun to look like something else, like weight he wasn't distributing properly. "You're working late again tonight?" she asked. "Probably." Sophie nodded and capped her travel mug and picked up her bag from the chair by the door where she always left it. A habit that had driven Marcus mildly crazy in the first years of their marriage because it felt careless, the bag just sitting there in the path of foot traffic, and then at some point had simply become part of the landscape of the house. The way her reading glasses on the nightstand were part of the landscape. The way the faint smell of her shampoo in the bathroom each morning was part of the landscape. These small irritations that become, without your noticing, the evidence of someone's presence. The proof they live there. "I'll be late tonight," she said. He looked up from his phone. "How late?" "I'm not sure." "Don't wait up." This had become a kind of refrain over the past few months. Don't wait up. He had stopped asking where she was going, not because he didn't want to know, but because each time he asked and she gave him an answer that sounded complete, but somehow wasn't. "Out with Renata. Just some errands. I needed air." He felt the question itself become a kind of accusation, and he did not yet want to be a man who accused his wife of things, so he had stopped asking. Their neighbor Daniel Pruitt knocked on the door that evening around 7, returning a router Marcus had lent him 2 weeks ago, and ended up staying for a beer in the way that Daniel always ended up staying for a beer, which was one of his defining qualities as a person. He was 45, recently divorced, and possessed of that particular social hunger that divorce sometimes leaves in people. Not desperation, exactly, but an awareness of how quickly an evening alone can become oppressive. "Sophie out again?" he said, settling onto the couch with the ease of someone who had done it many times. Marcus handed him the beer. "She has things." Daniel nodded, which was not the same as agreeing. "You two doing okay? Why do you ask that?" "I don't know." Daniel looked at his beer. "Just asking." Marcus sat in the chair across from him, and they watched a game neither of them was particularly invested in, and at some point Marcus realized that he had not spoken in nearly 20 minutes, and that Daniel, to his credit, had not tried to fill the silence, and that this sitting with someone in a room without needing to perform was something he had not done with Sophie in a very long time. He didn't know when that had changed. He couldn't find the seam where it had started to come apart. Sophie got home at 11:47. He knew because he'd checked his phone at 11:46 and again at 11:48, and her key in the door had come in between. He pretended to be asleep, or maybe he actually was asleep for a moment, and the sound of her in the bathroom woke him, the tap running, the soft movement of her feet on the hard wood. She slid into bed without touching him. He lay in the dark and listened to her breathing slow. Outside, a car passed. Then silence. The familiar weight of the mattress, the familiar geometry of the room, the familiar woman beside him who felt, increasingly, like someone he was failing to know. Marcus had always been methodical. It was something Sophie had said she loved about him in the early years. The way he thought things through, the way he never reacted from the surface of himself. And it was the thing that made him, in the middle of the 4th month of her late nights, begin to keep a log. He didn't write it down anywhere. It lived in his head, in the part of his head that ran calculations without his permission, tallying and cross-referencing. She left the house between 9 and 10 most nights. She returned between 11 and midnight. She was tired in a physical way, shoes off at the door, shoulders down, the kind of tiredness that lives in the body and not just the mind. She never smelled of alcohol. She never smelled of anyone else's cologne. She checked her phone less than someone having an affair would check their phone, or at least less than he'd imagined they would. And yet, he had sat with Renata Coles, Sophie's closest friend, at a birthday dinner in early March, and Renata had said something offhand. "I never see Sophie anymore. She's always so busy," and the words had snagged in him like a fishhook, small but barbed, impossible to remove cleanly. Sophie had said she was with Renata more than once, and Renata didn't seem to know what he was talking about. Though she'd covered quickly, laughed, said she'd forgotten, said they'd had coffee just last week. But the pause before the cover had lasted exactly long enough. He was not a man who confronted easily. This was one of his flaws, though he'd spent most of his adult life calling it patience. There was a version of patience that was wisdom and a version that was cowardice, and Marcus had been confusing the two for years without quite having the language for the distinction. At work, his colleague James had noticed something. James was perceptive in the blunt way of people who've never learned to be tactful about their perceptions. "You look like a man who's decided something," James said over lunch one day, not looking up from his sandwich. "What does that mean?" "It means your jaw's been doing that thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you've made up your mind about something and you're waiting for permission to act on it." Marcus looked at him. "That's very specific. You've been doing it for about 3 weeks. He had not made up his mind about anything. That was the honest answer. He had been building a case, assembling evidence, following the logical architecture of suspicion, the way he followed any other kind of problem. And the logic led somewhere he did not want it to lead, and so he kept adding variables, kept looking for the alternative explanation that would make the math come out differently. Sophie, for her part, had started doing something he couldn't quite name. She was present in all the technical ways. She made dinner twice a week. She asked about his projects. She remembered things he'd mentioned wanting to do and occasionally brought them up again. And yet there was something slightly performed about it. Not dishonest, exactly, more like effortful, like someone maintaining a structure they're worried might be showing strain. One night she sat beside him on the couch, close enough that their arms touched, and he felt her pause before she let herself lean into him, just slightly. A half-second calibration, as though she were checking the temperature of him before committing to the contact. "You're quiet," she said. "Tired. You're always tired lately." "Work," he said. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, something between concern and a more complicated sadness, and she said, "Marcus, what? Are we okay?" He turned the television volume down one notch, which was not an answer. "Why are you asking?" "Because I look at you sometimes and I can't tell what you're thinking." "You've always said that. It used to feel like you were thinking about something good." He didn't know what to say to that, and the silence stretched between them until it became its own kind of answer. Sophie looked at the television for a while, and then she said, softly and with a slight awkwardness that didn't quite fit the emotional texture of the moment, as though she'd briefly surfaced from the conversation into some other register entirely, "I don't know. Maybe like this story, or subscribe or something." Marcus turned to look at her. "What?" She blinked. The strange flatness in her voice was gone as suddenly as it had appeared. "Nothing," she said. and shook her head slightly and looked back at the television. I'm sorry. I don't know why I said that. He studied her face for a moment. She looked as confused as he did, perhaps more so. And then the moment closed like water over a stone, and they sat in silence for another hour, the television murmuring between them, each one alone inside their reasons. It happened on a Thursday in April, which was an ordinary sort of day to have the kind of conversation that reorganizes everything. Sophie came home at 12:15, which was late even by the new standard, and Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold in front of him, which was how she knew he'd been waiting. He did not look up immediately when she came in. She set her bag down on the chair. You're up, she said. I am. She stood in the doorway between the hall and the kitchen, still in her coat, watching him with the particular alertness of someone who knows the landscape has shifted but hasn't yet mapped the new terrain. Why are you so cold lately? She said. Not angry. Careful. The question of someone who has been gathering nerve for this. He looked up then, and she could see the cost of it in his face, the way the question had cracked something that had been carefully sealed. Where do you go? He said at night. I told you, Sophie. The single syllable of her name, said with that particular weight, stopped her. She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen clock ticked. They had bought it together at a farmer's market in Vermont 6 years ago, and neither of them had ever liked it very much. But it had become one of those objects that outlasts the moment that produced it and becomes simply furniture. I talked to Renata, he said, in March. She didn't know what nights I was talking about. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. She took off her coat slowly and draped it over the back of the chair nearest to her, and she pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, which he had not expected. He had expected her to remain standing. Remaining standing was the posture of defense. Sitting was something else. What do you think is happening? She asked. I don't know what's happening. That's why I'm asking. But what do you think? He looked at his cold tea. I think you're lying to me about where you are. And I think? He stopped. The word he didn't want to say sat in his mouth like something too large to swallow. I think you're somewhere you don't want me to know about. She held his gaze for what felt like a long time. There was something in her expression that he would think about later, in the weeks after this night. Something that looked, strangely, like relief. Or maybe like grief. The two can be hard to tell apart on a person's face when the feeling is deep enough. I'm working, she said. He blinked. What? I took a job. A night job. At a call center off Western, the one near the old hardware store. She folded her hands on the table. I've been working there since November. The kitchen was very quiet. The clock ticked. Why? He said. And here was the place where Sophie paused in the way that a person pauses when they have reached the edge of a truth they have been protecting and must decide now whether to step over it or step back. She looked at her hands on the table. She looked at him. Because we needed the money, she said. You've been underwater, Marcus. The business account. The loans. I found the letters from the bank last October. The ones you'd hidden in the filing cabinet under the tax documents. I didn't say anything because I could see how much it was costing you just to hold it together, and I thought if I could just... She stopped. Started again. I thought if I could buy us enough time, you could fix it without having to tell me you needed help. He said nothing. He sat very still in the way of a man who has just had the architecture of his certainty disassembled quietly and completely. I lied about Renata, she said. I'm sorry. I didn't want to explain why I couldn't come out with everyone, because then I'd have to explain why I was working nights. And... She shook her head. It got complicated. You've been working a second job, he said, for 5 months. Yes, because of my debts, because of our situation. The distinction was gentle and precise, and landed in him like a stone dropped into still water, spreading in every direction at once. He looked at her, this woman across the table with the early signs of exhaustion around her eyes that he had been reading for months as guilt, as deception, as the wear of a secret life. and he felt something that was not quite shame and not quite relief, but lived somewhere in the territory between them. "Sophie," he said. "Don't," she said, not harshly. "Not yet. I'm not finished being angry that you hid it from me in the first place." The months that followed had the strange quality of a recovery. Slow, non-linear, occasionally mistaken for the illness itself. Marcus told her everything in the weeks after that Thursday night, sitting at the same kitchen table over different evenings, unpacking the financial situation in the careful way of a man who has spent years being careful about the wrong things. The business had been struggling since the year before. He had borrowed to cover operating losses, then borrowed to cover the borrowing, and each time he had told himself the corner was just ahead, that competence and time would render the debt invisible. He had been wrong. More than that, he had been proud in the specific, costly way of someone who confuses admitting need with incurring defeat. Sophie listened. She was good at that, better than he was, better than he'd ever properly acknowledged. She didn't interrupt with reassurances or pivot to solutions. She let the full weight of it stay in the room. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked one evening in May. "I don't know." He turned his glass on the table. "I think I believed if I said it out loud, it became real in a way I couldn't manage. It was real whether you said it or not. I know that now. You knew it then too." He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "I knew it then too." Sophie had left the night job in late April, after the confrontation had cleared the way for something more honest, after Marcus had finally called the bank and begun the long, uncomfortable process of restructuring rather than concealing. She had not made a ceremony of quitting. She had simply not gone back, and the absence of those nightly departures had reshaped the house in a way that took both of them a few weeks to stop noticing. Renata knew most of it now. Sophie had told her in pieces over coffee, more to unburden herself than to explain, and Renata, who was practical and unshockable and had been quietly worried for months, had said only, "You should have told me. I could have covered for you better." Marcus had started doing something that surprised him. He had started on Saturday mornings sitting with his coffee at the table without his phone. Just sitting. Sophie would come down and find him there, and sometimes join him and sometimes not. And there was a quality to those mornings that was different from what they'd had before. Less smooth, less performed, but more honest somehow. More like two people actually in the same room, rather than two people maintaining the idea of a shared life. But honesty is not the same as repair. He understood that now in a way he hadn't before. The months of silence between them, his withdrawal, his carefully maintained suspicion, had not left the house when the truth had arrived. They lingered in particular moments, in the way Sophie still occasionally checked his expression before speaking, looking for the coldness, in the way Marcus sometimes caught himself starting to interpret her silences and had to actively, deliberately, choose not to. He had also begun, quietly, to sit with the realization that the distance of those months had not been entirely her doing. He had wanted, on some level, to be right about her. He had found a shape in the ambiguity that fit his fear, and he had lived inside that shape for months. And some part of him, the part he was least comfortable looking at directly, had almost preferred the clean, terrible clarity of betrayal to the more complicated reality of two people each drowning privately and too proud to say so. That was harder to carry than the original suspicion. It was a Sunday in late summer when Marcus found the notebook. He had been going through the top shelf of the bedroom closet, looking for an old jacket, and the notebook had been behind a stack of Sophie's things. Small, spiral-bound, the kind that costs less than $2 at a drugstore. He almost put it back without opening it. Then he opened it. It was a budget ledger. Her handwriting, precise and small, column after column. Dates going back to November. The night job hourly rate, $14.50 an hour. Hours worked. Amounts banked. A separate column for what she'd put toward his business account, routed through the joint savings so he wouldn't see the source. Month by month, patient as a tide, he stood in the closet for a long time. He had known this, in the abstract. She had told him. He had heard her. But there is knowing something, and then there is holding the physical evidence of it in your hands. The careful columns, the small, neat numbers, the months of silent Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday nights accounted for in ink, and finding that the two are entirely different experiences. She was downstairs. He could hear her moving in the kitchen, the sound of a cabinet opening, the tap running briefly, the ordinary music of her in the house that he had spent 4 months interpreting as proof of her absence, and could now hear clearly for the first time in a long time as what it was, the sound of someone staying. He sat down on the edge of the bed with the notebook in his hands. There was something he had been trying to locate for months, some understanding of where, exactly, things had gone wrong. And he had been looking for it in her behavior, in the gaps in her stories, in the lexicon of betrayal he'd been fluent in without ever having any cause to learn. That the answer was in this notebook, and it was not about her at all. It was about him. His fear of being seen as insufficient, his inability to say I'm in trouble to the one person in his life who would have helped him without condition, without judgment, without a single moment's hesitation. She had known, she had found out, and she had said nothing, and she had quietly, exhaustingly, solved the problem for him while he stood in their kitchen every morning watching her leave and building a story in which she was the one who was failing him. He heard her footsteps on the stairs. Sophie stopped in the doorway. She looked at him on the bed, at the notebook in his hands, and she was quiet for a moment. I found it in the closet, he said. I forgot it was there. He turned it over in his hands once, then set it on the bed beside him. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Sophie. He looked at her. I spent 4 months thinking you were, I know what you thought, and you knew the whole time what I was dealing with, and you didn't. He stopped. You didn't make me say it. Something moved through her expression then. Something complicated and careful. She came into the room and sat beside him on the bed. Not close enough to touch, but close. I didn't want to take that from you, she said quietly. The ability to tell me yourself when you were ready. I thought I was giving you time. That's not, Sophie, that's not why you didn't tell me. She was quiet. You were scared, he said. Same as me. You were scared of what it would mean if you said it out loud. She looked at her hands. Maybe. We were both hiding from each other. For different reasons. For the same reason, she said, just in different directions. The bedroom was full of late afternoon light, the warm flat light of August, and somewhere outside a neighbor's kid was riding a bicycle on the pavement, the sound of it rising and fading in a slow arc. Marcus looked at the notebook on the bed between them. He thought about all the nights he had lain awake in this room interpreting her silence, and not once had he asked himself what might be keeping her quiet. I'm sorry, he said, not for what I thought, for why I thought it, for how easy I made it to think the worst. She didn't reassure him. She didn't say it's okay, or I forgive you in the reflexive way of people who want discomfort to end quickly. She sat with the apology. Let it be the thing it was. After a while, she said, I'm tired, Marcus. I know. Not of you, just. She paused. Of carrying things alone. Both of us carrying things alone and calling it strength. Yes. They sat there for a while longer, side by side on the edge of the bed, the notebook between them with its small columns and careful numbers, its months of invisible labor. The kid outside finished whatever circuit he'd been riding and went somewhere else, and the street went quiet. Marcus reached over slowly and put his hand over hers, not dramatically, not with the weight of someone making a gesture. Just the way you reach for something that is close to you and real and that you have been failing to hold properly. Sophie turned her hand over and let him. The light shifted. The afternoon moved on. Outside, the neighbor's kid came back.